Lost time is never found again. Benjamin Franklin.
Hello, and welcome back to Time Flies, the show that talks about all things in relation to writing.
I'm Anya, one of your hosts, and I will be accompanied by Barcy, Lila, and Sloan, who are my partners. If you joined us last week, you know our podcast team has been reading a book called The Timekeeper by Mitch Albom.
In today's episode, we will expand on our previous topics and major themes of the book. We will discuss the ins and outs of The Timekeeper. Be sure to listen all the way through for the juicy details.
Here's a recap, just in case you missed our last episode.
There are three main characters in The Timekeeper: Dor, commonly known as Father Time; Sarah, a lonely teenage girl; and Victor, a rich businessman who is trying to beat death.
In this episode, we will be talking about all things related to Sarah, Victor, and the side characters greatest in the story.
Sarah Lemon is a teenage girl from a broken household with divorced parents. She lives with her mom and barely gets any contact with her dad, which worsens her mental health and her self-esteem. The only contact she seems to have are letters referring to her good grades that happen very infrequently.
She believes herself to be ugly, an outsider, and a weirdo. She has no friends at school and is very alone in her life, causing her to feel very unwanted and not have much self-worth.
She doesn't seem to realize that she has a loving mother, and that she isn't really alone.
That's true. One of the only good aspects of her life seemed to be Ethan, a boy whom she was head over heels for. Her feelings of loneliness and desperation for connection blind her to the red flags about Ethan.
Ethan tries to use her loneliness to his advantage and also causes her to make bad decisions, like drink and later waste her money.
She wastes her money by buying him a very expensive watch that he had mentioned earlier. She even engraves it with the message, "Time flies with you," connecting it to this story.
Unfortunately, she finds out that Ethan only flirted with her for his own advantages, and he dumps her before she is able to give him her very thought-through present. She is already at the lowest state she could be when she goes on his Facebook page.
She finds a post detailing the fact that she tried to make a move on him. Many people from her school comment on this post, agreeing with the idea that he made the right move dumping her. One comment even telling him to run away.
The sad thing is, she is the one that starts to run away from her problems. She pushes away her mom and stays inside every day. Soon enough, she decides that her useful time has run out on Earth.
On New Year's Day, her mother leaves to go to a party, and Sarah decides to end her life. Right before she is dead, Dor stops time. Dor takes her and Victor into a future where Sarah goes through with her horrible plan.
In this future, she watches her mother, the person that has always been there for her, cry as she sells the car that had helped with the act. At that moment, Sarah realized she needed to stay alive, if not for herself, then for her family. Sarah is then sent back to where she began, and she stops it all from happening. Instead of dying, Sarah becomes a scientist that changes the world.
Do you guys believe that Albom's portrayal of Sarah as a teenage girl was realistic?
I think that it was slightly unrealistic compared to real life, but I have to admit that it did portray Sarah's problem effectively. By having her whole life revolve around her crush, Ethan, her life became practically destroyed when things went wrong between the two of them.
When Ethan told Sarah about how he liked the watch from Men in Black, she bought him the watch with "Time flies on you" engraved in it as mentioned earlier. She got it for him as a present, yet Ethan didn't acknowledge the gift and turned her away. I noticed that when she purchased the watch for Ethan in chapter 42, Album wrote, "Sometimes, when you are not getting the love you want, giving makes you think you will." Do you agree with that?
I do. I think that some people feel as though giving someone things they love will cause that love to extend to them, even if the person they are giving things to does not truly care about them in the slightest.
If you ever met Sarah, what would you have told her to try and lead her in the right direction?
I think it's a kind of hard one. If I had a way to tell Sarah what she would do, I think that I would have told her that none of it was her fault and that she didn't need to change herself for others. I don't really know if it would help pull her out of the sadness she feels, but it'd be well worth to try.
Do you see Sarah's personality, as in feeling bad about oneself, in your present day life?
I'm, s- I'm sorry to see that I see lots of people that have low self-esteem. It isn't as common to see this level of sadness, but I still see people that doubt themselves and hurt themselves emotionally, just like Sarah did.
Now let's focus on Victor, who is a rich old man who suffers from terminal metastatic cancer. When Victor Delamont finds out that his kidneys have failed and that he will most likely die in the next couple of months, he does not wish to stand around and let himself die. Through an invigorating search, he decides that he will cheat death through cryonic freezing. Victor does not tell this to his wife and only family, Grace, and sets up his second life with his lawyers. Victor then researches the procedure and finds that he has a better chance of being brought back in the future if he is frozen right before his death. This pushes him to decide to get off life support and be frozen before all life has bled from his body. He plans his freezing for New Year's Day when his wife must go to a banquet. Right before he is about to be frozen, Dor freezes time.
Dor shows Victor his future after they both witness Sarah's future, or lack thereof. In the future, Victor would have succeeded in preserving his body, but this body would be kept in a museum as an exhibit to show visitors what life was like in the 21st century. He would never truly come back to life, and instead would become a mockery of the life he wished to keep so much.
When asking Dor about the papers he signed and all the promises, Dor replied these people have died, and that no one was left to watch over him. That these people had died just like he was supposed to. Once they go back to the present, Victor decides to not freeze himself and use the time he has left with his wife more wisely. He does die in the next couple of months, but he makes the most of the time remaining.
As we know, Victor's parents died when he was a child. With that being said, does anyone have a thought about how what happened with Victor's parents might have affected his relationships with time and fear of dying? Did it affect his relationship that he had with Grace?
After Victor's dad died, he said, "Make it yesterday," which Dor heard and remembered, allowing him to recognize his voice later and when they met, and further connecting them.
This also influences his decisions later on, making him unable to accept the reality of his own death, and going to extreme lengths to try and make his life longer and make himself able to come back to life later, instead of valuing the time he had left.
It could also influence his decision not to tell Grace, because he may not wish to get close to someone lest they leave or fight his decisions.
I think that now is the time to focus on our major side characters: Allie, Nim, Ethan, Lorraine, Sarah's mom, and Grace, Victor's wife.
Let's start with Allie. Allie, Dor, and Nim are childhood friends. They grow up together and eventually Allie and Dor are married. They have children and live happily for many years. When they are banished from their town, Dor and Allie try to make their life as similar to the one they left behind.
One day, after they have settled into their new place, an old couple that are poor and sick find their house. Allie, being the kind person she is, invites them in and gives them food, so that they do not have to leave hungry. A few days later, Allie comes down with the same horrible sickness as the couple.
On her last day of life, Allie and Dor use Dor's time creations to find the time that the sun will come up. The two of them sit on a hill and watch the sun rise. When Dor realizes that Allie is minutes away from death, he pushes the rest of the story into motion.
At the end of the story, Dora returns to Allie and, instead of running, stays with her until the end. And eventually, Allie is reunited with him and their children in the same place that comes next.
Does anyone wonder why Dora may have waited so long to try and ask the gods for help?
That did confuse me at first, but I realized that Dora may not have realized how real the situation was until he was on that hill. I also believe that he may have been just trying to escape his situation and the fact that the first person he had really loved was about to die. So I think it was a combination between him not realizing the situation fully and trying to escape the truth.
Now we move on to Nin. He grew up with Dora and Allie, but when he has grown, we can see how much he has changed and does not care about them. In his years away from them, he became cold and power-hungry, going as far as trying to create a way to overthrow the gods. He is ignorant and arrogant, believing himself to be powerful enough to overtake even the beings that control their world.
After he tries to force Dora to help him, he basically disappears from the story. But with his final act, he helps to push the story into action, just like Allie's almost death does.
Ethan is the next side character on our list.
Ethan is a teenager who only seems to care for himself. He volunteers to deliver food to a homeless shelter, where Sarah volunteers to prepare the food. When Sarah gets up the nerve to ask him out, he says sure, but he doesn't really care. The day of, he texts Sarah and tells her he won't be able to come, making her feel very unhappy. Sarah has them reschedule later on, but all they do is hang out in a warehouse and drink alcohol.
Ethan begins to lose interest in Sarah, and when she is about to give him his beautiful watch, he tells her that he has to go. Later on, he posts on Facebook a message that humiliates Sarah. When Dora shows the future that is without Sarah, she watches as Ethan talks with another girl and says that it wasn't his fault, showing that he seems to feel no remorse.
Ethan seems like someone that is too horrible to even exist in our present-day world. But do you ever see adolescents around you act as if they are high and mighty and don't care about anything or anyone else?
The sad thing is, many teens our age act as if they're better than everyone else. I know that there is a fine line between having no self-esteem and having too high of a self-esteem, and it seems like Sarah and Ethan show both sides of this line.
Do you guys believe that Ethan will ever grow out of this bad behavior?
The thing is, most teens eventually grow out of this, but since Ethan is already in the older side of high school, I don't really believe he will ever change completely.
Usually an event, like having someone hurt themselves because of your behavior, would push someone to straighten up. But as we saw, even after hearing about Sarah's death, Ethan seems unfazed. Maybe we are wrong, but Ethan has a long way to go if he wants to change for the better.
That's true. Now let's move on to Sarah's mom, Lorraine.
Lorraine is not very present in the beginning of the book. She's introduced as a divorced mother who doesn't have a great relationship with her daughter. Sarah doesn't talk to her mother like she used to and keeps everything from her. On New Year's Eve, Lorraine goes to a party with the rest of her divorced friends, leaving her daughter alone.
In the future, Lorraine blames herself for Sarah's death and causes Sarah to finally realize how much her life mattered to those that she loved most.
Do you guys think Lorraine could have helped Sarah at all?
I think that no matter what, Sarah would have pushed away Lorraine until she realized that it wasn't her fault that her father had left and would speak with her. Maybe Lorraine should have stayed with her on that fateful night, but I don't think we can blame her for anything. And if it had happened, she shouldn't have blamed herself.
Now that we have covered every character relating to Sarah, let's focus in on Grace, Victor's wife.
Grace meets Victor in an elevator. Grace is the bookkeeper for Victor's firm. He asks her out through interoffice mail, which might have foreshadowed their love becoming more like a job. They get married 10 months later with over 300 of Victor's work associates present. Their marriage starts very loving, with the two of them spending almost all their time together.
Sadly, they begin to drift away from each other as their marriage drags on. They kept themselves mostly separate until Victor realized he was close to death. At the time, Grace is at his side, When Victor decides to be frozen, he does not tell his wife because he knows she will disapprove. At the end of the story, to stop himself from being frozen, Victor uses the code word that was decided on at the beginning with his lawyers. He says "Grace," and the freezing process is stopped. He is put back on life support and lives out the rest of his life with Grace.
Why is the code word Grace? Why might this be significant?
I think that the code word is grace because grace is Victor's, in a way, last tie to the living world.
In other words, by saying Grace's name, it's almost as if Victor is pulling on a tether to bring him back to the living realm.
Other than being related to two of the main characters, what are some things that Lorraine and Grace have in common?
Other than being connected to the main characters, I think that Lorraine and Grace are the things that hold Victor and Sarah from doing things that would hurt themselves.
Now that we've finished with everyone's backstories, let's move on to some more questions.
How can we apply what the characters learned in The Timekeeper to our life?
The average person could apply this to their life by valuing their time in life and by spending it to the best of their abilities to be happy and make accomplishments, instead of wishing their life away and trying to find ways to control the time they have left.
It's very interesting how in the book there's so many phrases to accept the passage of time is either too fast or too slow.
I like that you brought that up. I believe that the suffering that Sarah and Victor faced affected their view of time and how much they had remaining. They both had convoluted ideas of time, constantly wanting more or less, or wanting to control it, and it took Dora's intervention and the message she showed them for them to be able to truly value both their time and their lives.
Thanks for tuning in, and make sure that you join us for our next episodes. It's not set in stone, but we think we'll be reading a Greek mythology book next week.
Want to ask a question on a future episode of Podcasting Q&A? Click on the link in the show notes to record your questions in a voice message.
Bye! The last thing I would like to speak on for this podcast series are the other famous books written by Mitch Albom. He started out writing sports columns in newspapers before gradually getting into writing fiction. The first book Albom wrote was titled Bo: Life, Laughs, and the Lessons of a College Football Legend. It is a sports-related novel that was published in 1989. He wrote many more sports novels until he met with his former teacher, Maurice Swartz, who was dying of Lou Gehrig's disease, a disease that weakens a person's muscles and impacts how a person's body can work. He wrote the book Tuesdays with Maurice as a memoir for this teacher. This book gave him national acclaim and made its way onto the New York Times bestseller list. He wrote many other fiction books that pertain to death, life, time, truth, and more. The Timekeeper itself was number 1 on the New York Times bestseller list when it was first published. Another of his books, The Stranger in the Lifeboat, was number 1 on the New York Times bestsellers list, as well as being number 1 on Amazon. His most recent novel is The Little Liar, published in late 2023. This book speaks about truth and how easy it is to push away from truth, even if you are the most avid follower. Some of his most famous books have been made into movies. A few of these being Tuesdays with Morrie, The Five People You Meet in Heaven, which is a book about an old man who dies, and when going to heaven, he finally learns why his life matters, and Have a Little Faith, which is a true story about belief and life's purpose. Mitch Albom intends to continue writing more books for a long time after this. As you have seen, Mitch Albom has written many fiction and non-fiction works that always change the way life can be viewed.